For a second. Brilliant. Now everyone else can also see me. Welcome back to finally another session of All the King's Horses, All the Queen's Men. Sorry that it didn't really work out last week, but now we're back, and if we were a television series, we're back with regular scheduling. What we're going to do today is basically, I'm going to very briefly sum up what we've sort of talked in the last session. That is sort of everything concerning cultural memory, everything concerning history, myth, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because we did I did extensively somewhat talk about that. But what I want to do today is mostly that we will have a look at the question of heritage films. So this is, one of the sort of cornerstones of this seminar, and we really haven't talked about it. So I have two examples, and one example is actually something that you will be able to, work through and work with. So it won't be just me talking today. Hopefully it won't be just me talking today. But let's see. Let me just switch. Now you can see that. So basically, I think what we left off, I was kind of one slide further, but this is what we left off. We kind of talked about the idea or the necessity of cultural memory when we construct national identities, in the sense of that we have things or institutions of learning, institutions of preservation that sort of not only preserve cultural memory or these artifacts, but they also put them in a certain order. They arrange these artifacts in a certain way, which makes that comprehensible to us. But these are not, innocent arrangements, of course. They are always put in a certain order and a certain structure for a certain effect. And I think we briefly talked about the uniform of Nelson and how Nelson has become this national hero in general, who is very important for a construction of a national identity of the British and the English. If we talk about the Navy and the idea that the Navy is one of the cornerstones of that identity. And the point is that I think I left off with basically that what these institutions of learning, these institutions of preservation and sort of arrangement or these museums actually do is they cultivate these very artifacts on the one hand, but on the other hand they also function as ways of teaching the nation to the nation, and they create myths. So this idea of Nelson being this national hero is partially myth making, and usually myth making is sort of concerned or often connected, especially if we talk about the common meanings of it, with some sort of untruth. It's not quite history, it's something that has been changed, something that isn't quite true. And the point is that on the one hand, these myths and these stories essentially that we tell through museums, these stories that we tell through films, etc., they have a comforting function as they offer a secure frame for human experience. But not only that, but especially if we talk about untruth and truth and history and accuracy and authenticity, which is something that will come pretty much in handy when we talk about heritage films, because they are usually concerned with, they are very authentic, they're very real, they're very, I think there's a couple of heritage films where it's really important to stress they're very, very close to the real historic events that they portray, and these films make the point of being very authentic to these historic events. But we shouldn't really talk about the question of truth or untruth or fiction, because all of them have a function, and this is what we'll focus on. And in this case, Hill says not necessarily untruth or fiction, so both museums, but all institutions that sort of preserve and educate and transmit cultural memory, they are not, even in their myth-making process, they're not untruth or fiction. They might contain elements of verifiable truth. Their real purpose, however, is not to present past events with complete accuracy, so much as to tell a story that conveys important ideas about the present and its relationship to the past. And if we go back to these uniforms, this is exactly what we see. It is there to tell a story, namely the story of Nelson as a hero, not the story of the Battle of Trafalgar, not the history of the Royal Navy, but a particular story about Nelson. And that particular story has a particular function within the framework of national identity. And talking about national identity, we're going to be talking about Scottishness and brave in this case. So I believe we kind of touched upon that already, because I asked, what do you think Scottishness means? What are the first things you think of when you hear Scottishness? And it's usually, I think most people just kind of went with, it's the kilt and the bagpipe, and it's the rough people basically of the Highlands. And this is sort of kind of what we think of when we hear Scottishness. So it goes kind of in the direction of what Merida's father is wearing. He's wearing the tartan, and he has the little bag right in front of his crotch, and he's wearing a pelt. So that's kind of the stereotypical image of Scottishness. And we're going to be looking at a very brief scene in the following. That is this one. No, wrong one. So I hope that all works. Give me that. You can't hear anything. That's always a good thing. Let me switch that. We're going to be watching that in a moment. Perfect. Let me go back. It's a very short scene, and what I want you to basically look at is how is Scottishness in this particular instance constructed. So what are the markers of it? And again, we have talked about it, so it's kind of a summing up, but still, let's go back and do that again. The audio doesn't really work, but okay. I don't know what exactly happened there, but you get the gist of it, basically. So, how is Scottishness portrayed? How are the Scottish portrayed in this very instance? Apart from the kilts and the bagpipes and all of that. Yes?
So it's very traditional, I'd say. Like it's set in this castle, very dark at first, like only lit by candles.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Then like this entire crowd of people comes in there, but they are like the normal people. They're like, I don't know. They don't seem rich or very influential.
Okay, yeah.
Like and then they have like their leader figures, so it's kind of like hierarchies.
Yeah, absolutely.
In this particular way and everything,
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just kind of collecting. Yes.
Yeah, it's like this portrait with all these different clans.
Yeah, it's the clans. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like everybody has a different dressing. Everybody has a different, kind of tartan and color of the kilts, and this flags behind, and the guy in the middle also with these war paint, so they all have a different style, and like I think that's probably their like Hofstaat. I don't know in English.
Yeah, it's basically their court. So potentially those are the clans. These are the lairds of those clans. So the sort of the not really the king, but certainly someone who is hierarchically above them. Yes, please.
They seem very rough and chaotic a bit.
Huh?
The way they walk in.
Mm-hmm.
They're not in a formation, but just like stream into this courtroom like a big mass.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. They're very uncoordinated in a way. Yes.
And they also seem very proud, because as you see also in the last picture right here, they're all standing there just out, really strong pose, and so I think they're also really proud people.
Yeah. It's also because the one on the left-hand side basically just has to get a box in order to get to the same level as the others. Yes, absolutely. What else? If we talk about history, how accurate do you think that is? I mean, this movie has been sort of proposed especially in Scotland, as being very accurate, right? So they portray the true Scottishness, so to speak. How do you think, how accurate is that? I mean, it's not Braveheart, at least. Yeah.
But I think there is some sort of accuracy because like all of these different clans had like these different colored or coordinated fabrics. Like every clan had their own kind of print in their tartans, so I think that's probably accurate. I don't know if these particular existed, I don't know, but at least that they're different is a good point, I think. And
yeah.
Probably they all had flags, I think, also.
Very likely they had all flags, but yeah, usually a very particular clan standard. It's a very good point that you mentioned the Tartans. Yes, you had your hand.
I wanted to ask because
yeah.
the Braveheart was mentioned, and the middle one is a little bit reminiscent of the Braveheart, like blue war paint. I don't know if that is as accurate, and that's actually my question. Wasn't that would in such a ceremonial environment, would there be men sporting war paint?
It depends on the picture you want to give. No, I'm just, put a pin on that, and you had your hand raised.
Of course, I know it's very accurate that there are these many clans and clan leaders that need to go to the king, or more like the king needs to invite them because he needs their support and they need his support. So that's quite accurate.
Okay. On the matter of Scottish kings, that accurate or not? If you think back to, I don't know which session it was, but when I extensively talked about Scotland and the sort of political questions, accurate, not accurate, kind of, not so much. Yeah, I think is probably the best way. So yeah, there is, I think it goes into the more accurate direction in the sense of we did have Scottish kings, or the Scottish had Scottish kings for a long period of time, so there was some sort of political unity. So that goes into the correct direction, especially with the clans. But this is maybe, if we'll talk about that, and I mean you've seen Angus. I'm not quite sure if I click on yeah, it moves away very slowly. But he is obviously sort of the king of these clans, or at least the one they look to, and he would not be dressed like that because the king would probably not reside in the highlands, he would reside in the lowlands, with the political center being Edinburgh in this case. Now going back to the war paint, I'm not going to go back because then the scene plays again and but the war paint is a bit weird. It goes into the direction of Picts. They usually had war paint, but that is complete different timeline, completely different dress, and completely different moment to wear that. So usually they wouldn't be painted like that. There were paints like that, body paints. Some of them were actually tattooed on. Some of them were painted on, especially, but where it goes kind of accurately, is that only someone higher up in the hierarchy would wear that, because blue paint is incredibly expensive during that time. Making blue paint in any form is not only very long, but very, very expensive. It goes into, at least at that time, into the direction of wearing purple. Very, very rare. So it would only be someone higher up in the hierarchy, but it's also completely wrong timeline, completely wrong moment in time to wear that. You wouldn't probably go to someone and go like, hello, I'm painted for war, but I'm just here for a visit. So there goes that.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if it isn't like quite weird that he's wearing war paint when they should marry like her.
Yeah, what is marriage but war? I don't know. Oh God, I shouldn't be quoted on that. Nice that I'm broadcasting that to the outside. No, but generally, you wouldn't probably be dressed like that. Also in Scotland, I always wonder, it's kind of foggy, it probably rains, that war paint would probably not really, stay there or stay on for a very long time. But generally, yes, that's not exactly accurate. And of course, if I talk about the entire question of heritage film, and this is not necessarily a traditional heritage film, right? However, it does portray some sort of heritage. And we see some of the main points of heritage films and the main problems of heritage films also within Brave. And this is where I go back to the question of tartan, because it's good that you said, you know, every clan wears his own or her own, its own pattern or its own tartan. And this is indeed the case. There is a register of tartans in Scotland, and each clan, each part, some of the clans aren't really, you know, clans any longer, but there are certain parts of Scotland that have their own pattern of tartan. And now, of course, we have this sort of setting in the kind of medieval-ish times. It's also never referred to as Scotland, but it's from everything that's being used visually and audibly is, of course, kind of Scotland already. Where do you think do the tartans come from? Who wears tartans? Why are they worn? Do they all look like that? Any time frame maybe? You know, it's not the when was the tartan invented, but when did you think was it worn most likely? I mean, apart from nowadays in touristy circumstances. Yes.
I thought that tartans were connected to the clan structure, so that the similarities within the tartan also represent the relationships between clans and are a sign of recognition for other people. I think but it stopped after the clans decline or the fall down of the clan system, and then just researched as kind of a touristy thing, I believe, when the whole I think Walter Scott Scottish nostalgia came up, and after that there was like beginning of 20th century resurgence of tartan tourist merchandise.
Have you been in one of my seminars before?
I know, but I was in Professor Kuhn's seminar in National Identity. Yeah.
Ah, damn it. Ah, okay. So that's you have an advantage there. It's always a good question to ask. I mean, I'm still asking it. It's not quite the 20th century, but you're getting close there. It's actually the 19th century. So generally, when I ask that question and I don't have someone who has taken one of Professor Kuhn's lectures or seminars, they're usually going like, yeah, it's probably pretty all right. You know, it's probably medieval. It looks medieval. It feels medieval. I mean, he's also wearing chainmail, so that seems to be accurate, but it's actually not. And I mean, we have been talking about heritage films and the invention of these films and of national identity. So this is exactly what happens with the tartans, basically. Tartan is not exactly something that is very often worn before the 19th century, and we're talking about 1820s here. So before that, the tartan is worn mostly by Highlanders, you know, the barbaric ones in the north that the lowlands who wear pantaloons and trousers don't really talk about. So it's very much connected to the Highlands and to, you know, the rough people up north and the clans, and they're all very fast bred and so on and so forth. But it's mostly worn in order to get by pretty nicely in the Highlands, because you have heather. You would probably get stuck pretty easily if you would be wearing trousers, because heather is very rough, like the people up there. Okay, but anyways, generally trousers wouldn't be really practical. You don't have the same range of movement, for instance, which you would have in the kilt. So this is something that is being worn by Highlanders, and it's being actually forbidden in 1746, something like that. That is where the hammer falls on the kilt, because it sort of is the idea that everyone should be wearing, you know, proper clothes in a way, and they do want to rule out this very strong regional Highland culture. So the kilt, as one of the practical clothes that they are wearing, is kind of ruled out, and it's banned by law. So people obviously, you know, move to something else, wear other clothes. The kilt kind of falls into well, it's kind of forgotten. But then there is, of course, the royal, I mean, of course, I'm saying of course because I know, but there's the royal visit by George IV. He is to visit Scotland, or Edinburgh in particular, in the 19th century, roughly around, I think the visit is scheduled for 1824, and there is Sir Walter Scott. And we also have a long period, 19th century or 18th century is a very long debate on patriotism, on identity. We have a couple of Scottish myths and fairy tales that are being written and published. So there is this, as you so rightly said, there is this period of nostalgia essentially for, you know, the real Scottishness. Also, we're bang in the middle of the empire and the imperial conquest. So there is this idea and this need to kind of separate the Scottish from the rest of the UK in some form. And this royal visit kind of sparks the Royal Society to come up with something particularly Scottish. And because the kilt was sort of kind of known, people wanted to see that. And Sir Walter Scott, who writes extensively about Scottishness, kind of doesn't invent it, but he brings it back. And he also makes the case for a very strong economic Scotland, or a strong economic note in Scotland, because what happens is basically that he asks the mills and, you know, the fabric weavers to come up with patterns for the clans. So all the clans are being invited, and what they get is kind of merchandise. They get their own pattern. So what George IV sees when he enters, or when he comes to Edinburgh, is all of these people dressed in essentially proper Scottish clothes. Because how do you know, how to become very different from someone who wears trousers? You obviously wear something else that isn't trousers. So they're all wearing kilts. It's on the one hand a very strong Scottishness and a very strong separation between us and the other, but on the other hand it's also an economic point and a myth-making process. So if I just click on, because I am not quite sure what's next on the slide. So far nothing is on the slide because I'm not in PowerPoint. Let's move on. You can't see that. So just to go back, because that film has been, especially by Scottish National Party, or by the Scottish National Party, being seen as one of the Scottish films. It was produced by Disney, or by Pixar in this case. So not a Scottish, not a British, not anything related to Europe film production company. So this is a Caledonian excellence. Scotland rallies behind brave animation and hopes it will buoy tourism. Disney Pixar shows a Scotland free from drug abuse and midges, which, to be fair, is something that Trainspotting did. Little wonder it has received government approval. Brave, one of the most lavish depictions of Scotland as well, you know, and so on and so forth. So this is not exactly the important point, but the important point is this book, the costume of the clans. This is the legitimization for the tartan, for this tartan that we see. And this is basically the start where Scotland becomes incredibly tightly linked with the tartan and this sort of traditional Highland dress. Because, as I said, that Sir Walter Scott essentially comes up with those, I mean, he doesn't come up with the patterns, but he comes up with the idea that Scottish people being dressed that way, that is some kind of traditional clothing. So also, funnily enough, the kilts are being unbanned by the law, but the Highlanders don't really start wearing them any longer unless they're, you know, part of a clan structure, or they're part of the clans that have enough money to buy a pattern, for instance. So the thing is that those clans start sort of creating this narrative of, oh no, we have always worn this tartan, we have always worn this pattern. This is particularly a traditional clan name, insert here, pattern of that we have always had. But it's really hard to legitimize that if you don't have any written, you know, any written documents on it. And there are two English brothers, funnily enough, and they basically find this book. They write it themselves, but they find it. And this becomes one of the legitimizations for wearing tartans and wearing patterns, because this book essentially lists all the tartan patterns, all the clans, and how long they have been wearing it. It makes up names, it makes up histories. It's very close to the clans and the history of the clans, but it kind of weaves in the tartan here. Well, that's a bad pun, also very fitting. Anyways, but this is what happens. And the clans, I mean, they can't really say, oh, what? No, someone made up that history. They actually go with it. And this is why it receives so much legitimization. Eventually, the brothers that have written that, they are being discredited. It's being found out that it's all a hoax and all fake and all of that. But the thing is, it's still being used today as a legitimization. Even though it's pretty much known that it's a hoax, it's still being used because it creates this nice narrative. And if we go back to that quote that I showed, it's not about truth or fiction. It's not about truth or untruth or about historical accuracy. It's just about the story it creates. And this book creates an incredibly fruitful story for the clans, because it also legitimizes the clans, not only the Tartan, but it legitimizes through historical leniency, basically, that they have always been there, that they have a right to not own the Tartan, but to be Scottish, right? So this is sort of the invention, and I think that is also what Professor Kühn usually teaches, is not only the invention of national identity, but the invention of tradition. This entire question of Tartans, and if you ever want to read it up, is from a book called The Invention of Tradition by Eric Hobsbawm. And he sort of traces these ideas. He traces the invention of the tradition of Christmas, because we never really question these traditions. We never really question, where does the Tartan actually come from? We just take it for granted that it's there and that it has historical legitimacy in some form. Same with Christmas traditions. Of course, we have personal ones, but the overarching theme of, like here, pine trees and so on and so forth, that is something we don't quite question. We don't really know the history of how that comes to be, and so on and so forth. So this is basically what Hobsbawm notes. We need to question these ideas. We need to question how that comes to be. And this is what he does with Christmas, what he does with other traditions, but most particularly, as I said, with the Tartan. And concerning the Tartan that we have here, I'm not quite sure what happened with the slide. But it looks quite interesting, so I'm going to briefly read it out. So this Tartan in particular is called the Dunbroch Tartan. And as I've said, there is a register of all the clan Tartans in Scotland. So it's the Tartan register, which you can't read because it's very sneakily not readable in this case, but the Tartan register sort of made up a Tartan pattern in particular just for this film. And it has also an explanation which I find quite interesting, especially if we talk about that in the sense of it creates some kind of myth and some kind of story, because it says the Dunbroch Tartan was designed with subdued rich colors to reflect the rugged natural setting of Scotland. Representative of the tartan worn by the royal family in Brave, the pattern is neither splashy nor bright, but organically refined in its color sense. Organically refined with blue color. Totally legit. There was a concerted effort to use hues that were indicative of the less saturated dyeing techniques during the ancient period in which the fantasy film is set. Again, especially with blue, that is very tough because blue is very hard to come by, especially in Scotland. The Dunbroch Tartan is the original work of Pixar's animation studios and is protected by applicable copyright and trademark laws. Maybe as a side note, Corona has completely fucked with my language application, so you might hear a lot of interesting things, even more interesting than usual. Only to be woven with the written consent of Disney and Pixar. Colors, much like Scotland itself, the Dunbroch Tartan is set against the ocean blue of the North Sea. Someone has not been at the North Sea in this case. The deep scarlet represents the family's reverence for its own history and the blood shed during the battles between the clans. Deep green shows a love for Scotland's majestic highlands, where the story of Pixar's Brave unfolds. Navy blue and its clear central intersections represents the forging of the clans within the Dunbroch kingdom. And finally, the subtle grey imbues a sense of respect for the inner soul of the strong Scottish people. So again, it's not about anything. It's not really about coming up with a tartan, and those tartans are never without any sort of history attached to that, and that has a very strong connection to a Scottish or particular kind of Scottishness, strong people, the inner soul, and so on. It's also, especially if we talk about the soul, it's always very essential. So this is something that is essentially Scottish, of course. Again, especially if we talk about the weaving and the dyeing techniques during that time, blue is not really on the register. It's very hard to come by, it's very tough, although we, especially in Germany and in Europe, we do have, I'm not going to get into too much of that, but it's pretty tough to do that in this case, especially that saturation. Anyways, so it is because of, if you look at the ideas or basically the explanation of the tartan register, you can actually sort of see why the SNP was so strongly in favor of it. Not only because of the tartan, but because of essentially the way Scotland is portrayed. It's pure, it's strong, it always kind of goes against others and is very, very contained also in some form. Especially if we look at 2012, it is very shortly before the referendum 2014 in Scotland, so they really needed strong identities or visual markers of identity. And because we are talking about films already, and I've already said it's not really a traditional heritage film, but it goes into the same direction. Now, question is, have I said something about the performance of national identity and why it's important? I'm not quite sure. Okay, so good. 2 people just going, no, she hasn't. Good. So what these films do and what heritage films, these films, Braveheart, it doesn't really matter what they portray as long as it's a really positive sort of portrayal. So Braveheart has been used extensively to, especially in the independence referendum. Braveheart has been used, Brave has been used also. It's a very interesting linkage, especially with the names, but also other films, where the Scottish are being seen as resisting the evil English, that has been used as a positive sort of visual representation. Not so much Train Spotting, because no one really wants to see that kind of Scottishness being portrayed, although you could potentially make the argument that Train Spotting is an alternative or even anti-heritage film, because it does portray some kind of heritage, not a positive one, not one that you want to sort of have people known about, but it is one, so fair. No, but what these films do is they essentially function like museums. They are institutions, social institutions of preservance, and they are institutions of transmittance. And of course, unlike museums, they are very popular, usually very popular. They reach a very, very broad audience. And this is what makes them both interesting and some kind of problematic. Because if you have this popularity and if you want to reach a multinational audience, you need to condense these performances to very recognizable sorts of images and iconography. And I think we've sort of talked about the English iconography, the rolling green hills, or very pleasant, very pastoral, and so on and so forth. This is exactly what, just going to go with that, this is exactly what Brave also does. It uses a very condensed iconography of Scotland. That is not true, nor is it fiction, but it has a certain function. And these functions and these stages are quite vital if we talk about the performance of national identity, because national identity doesn't really work if it's not put into practice. Identity is always something you perform, whether it's your personal identity, whether it's collective identities, there always needs to be a stage. And I think I mentioned Irving Goffman already. It's all kind of like a theater play. You need props, you need a stage, you need actors, you need a certain script. And films are, of course, quite interesting because they encompass all of that, because they are essentially theatrical. But this is also with regards to the Olympic Games. This is something with regards to sports events, etc., etc. These are all stages with certain props, certain actors, certain scripts attached to it. The thing is with heritage films in particular, they are very much, how to put it? They're heavily scripted, so there is not a lot of I mean, obviously they are scripted, but there are also, especially if we talk about the genre, there are certain things they always need to fulfill. They need to show a certain kind of heritage. They also need to be kind of commodified. So especially when you think about heritage sites and certain stately manor houses in England, they are always being used in these heritage films. So what these films do is they perform a certain kind of, it's like every time, you know, if someone says fuck and it goes beep, this is exactly what I think all these sirens always do. But generally, these heritage films, they perform national identity, a very particular kind, and they make it both available for a national audience and they make it available for an international audience. And this is incredibly significant in order to sort of construct national identities, because they also provide us with certain images that are usually so highly conventionalized that they are being recognizable for both a national audience and an international one. But the international audience in the back of these in the back of the mind of these producers, for instance, or these films, is always a bit of a problem, namely because it relies on these conventionalized images. You know, I mean, I've said a lot of things about the Tartan and about the portrayal of Scottishness. That's of course not a real portrayal of Scottishness, but because films and television series and popular culture in general has this two-way process, it takes from a culture, but it also feeds back into a culture. This is exactly what happens here. The more these images are being used, the more they become legitimate, and the more they're being used. So there's always this sort of two-way process where popular culture and, you know, the culture surrounding it always kind of depend on one another. And this is why heritage films being made about a nation, are always significant for the portrayal and the performance of a nation, because they provide us with these things. They, as I already said, they basically teach the nation to the nation. And this is exactly what happens with Brave, but this is also what happens with heritage films. And now I'm just going to move on quickly, but has any one of you read the Higson text? Kind of? Yes, you have. Also kind of, that's brilliant. It's not some kind of, wow, what did I do? Anyways, this is not what I wanted to do, but yeah, I said, no, we're not going to watch that. Okay. I always wanted to do a seminar where I have that as my background music. It's a lovely soundtrack, really. I don't know why it's doing that. And now it's gone, fortunately. Might also be a bit loud to have that playing in the background all the time. Okay, that is a quote that I completely skipped. Taking the minutes. No, I also said that kind of. You know what? I'm going to switch. At the moment, you don't need to see any of the quotes, I think. Anyways, so heritage films. How far have you read along the lines of aesthetic, film style, etc., etc.? Like how are they being made, and what kinds of camera angles and so on are used? You're nodding. Anyone really familiar with film styles, camera angles, and so on and so forth? Yeah, no, okay. Then I'm just going to kind of move on, because I said most of the things already, and what I haven't said I will sort of add to that, but I'm going to jump sort of a bit forward, because while we need to talk about heritage films, I have said quite a number of things already about them. Maybe as a side note again, they are not as Brave, and as you see with the reactions of Brave, it's not always about making films about a certain recognizable moment in the past, but it's mostly about films, or sort of films being made to talk about the present. So there's one quote by Chapman who basically says the only reason to make films about the past is to talk about the present. So especially if you look at the construction of national identity or national identities in general, films that are vital for constructing or that are vital for England, Britain, Scotland, etc., you can usually pinpoint when that nation was kind of in trouble or which parts of the nation they wanted to highlight. So if you look at 2014 to 2019, you have a lot of films made about the Great War in Britain, especially by Kenneth Branagh, for instance, or where Kenneth Branagh is surprisingly in it. But generally, every time a nation is kind of threatened, every time it's about to break up, or if there's some kind of social change, political change, cultural change happening, you usually see a resurgence of what is essentially a Heimatfilm. It's not really the case with Germany, but generally, those are different Heimatfilme, but generally you have these sort of films that are very much concerned with a certain heritage and a certain nation. One of the examples is in the 1980s, there is, and I think I've mentioned that film before, is the film Chariots of Fire. That is being produced and it comes out in, I think, 1980, and the reception is a bit lukewarm. It's being shown, but it's mostly some kind of small artistic film that no one really watches. And then the Falkland War happens. And suddenly Britain or England is at war with Argentina, or with the Argentine, and they're fighting about the Falklands. And Britain wins, so the Falklands stay a colony of the British. And in that year, in 81, 1 year after it was originally released, Chariots of Fire is re-released. And Chariots of Fire is about the Olympic Games, and it sort of highlights that the British, those amateurs, but they are really good, and they defeat, of course, the Americans in particular. They defeat everyone, they win, yay! And suddenly that film is incredibly popular. One of the most popular films even in that year. It wins an Oscar. I think it even wins more than one Oscar. But suddenly this is an incredibly popular film, and it becomes the film in that year. And in a way, for not centuries, but for decades to pass, because Chariots of Fire then becomes a radio drama. It becomes a theatre play. It is re-released in 2005, I believe. Then it becomes another theatre play. And then Rowan Atkinson is there, during the proms and kind of reenacts this very famous scene where people run along the beach. So suddenly Chariots of Fire becomes one of the staples, not only of heritage cinema, but it becomes a staple of British cinema. All because it comes out at exactly the right moment in time where the British need to be reminded that they are the winners. And this is what Chariots of Fire does over and over and over again. But if we talk about heritage films, and here I am going to skip, we do need to talk about, okay. We need to talk about film technical aspects, because we're of course going to be talking about film. Generally we wanted to start today, but surprise, surprise, we won't. But we're going to talk a bit about film at least. Okay, so what we need to sort of investigate, or what we need to deal with, is the question of how to talk about films. What are the aspects that we need to talk about when we need to talk about films, or when we do talk about films? General aspects. Yes?
I guess it's about camera angle and like lighting.
Yeah.
Like also in general, like coloring of film.
Yeah, absolutely. Color, light, yes?
It's about the scenes, so maybe if it's outside, the landscapes, and if it's filmed inside, dimensions, maybe if it's a royal family, that you have a big palace and something like that.
Interior and exterior shots, yes?
And also like decoration, I would call it, and costume design. For
Mhm.
example, like sometimes like stronger characters have like bolder colors, and some that are a little more like shy and stuff. They have like more like pastel colors or something like that.
Good point, yes? Yeah, absolutely.
Also stuff like, I would call it mood.
Mood.
and Setting.
Yeah, setting. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Yeah.
Maybe even how it's cut.
Editing. Yeah, definitely something we need to talk about.
Yeah, also stuff like sounds and music and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, everything you can hear, not everything you can see. It's a visual media, but it's an audio-visual media. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, sometimes those films are connected to historical events that really happened like that, and then you can compare what is really shown and what is left out.
Mm-hmm.
So they show what is for that film really important and what's not.
Yeah, they are very selective in what they show. You raised your hand, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to say historic accuracy, but that ties into what she just said.
Yeah.
I don't know if she already said that, but film music is really important too.
It's sound and music. I think you mentioned kind of sound. But yes, soundtracks are part of the entire thing. Yes. Anything else we need to talk about? All right. So generally, if we talk about films, one of the more, and it comes as a huge surprise probably to you, is that no background within a film is generally innocent. They're all very much structured. They're all very selectively chosen. So if we look at this background or at this scene, you would immediately glean certain character elements from whoever embodies or whomever is placed within this space. You would know something about the class background. Which class background would it be?
Like royalty.
Yeah, upper class, royalty, aristocracy, probably not working class, most likely not working class, also potentially not middle class unless you really want a lot of gold in your room. But generally, we immediately know this is a certain class background already because of the colors, because of the gold, because of the paintings, etc., etc. It always tells us something about the capital people have. What about age? Who could, age-wise live in one of these rooms? What would you say?
I would guess someone maybe like 50 and up, because of also the pictures on the desk.
Yeah.
Because they are black and white, so maybe from someone's childhood, and
Mm-hmm.
it depends also on which century it's filmed, but
Mm.
kind of in that direction.
From the interior, what century would you kind of go with? Or could you actually pinpoint a time period just from looking at this?
I would say not so really, because like it just reminds me of like museums. I mean, they look like 17, 1800 still today, and you can still walk through and look how they lived. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if it changed that much.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would say like 1700s because of the paintings, like the dresses that they are wearing
Mm-hmm.
are kind of reminiscent of that time.
Okay, yeah.
I would say minimum 1900s because of the pictures, because the camera was not invented in 17 something.
That's
So-
true. So if it's a daguerreotype, then we would have a 1850s, 60s, 70s kind of room, but generally that would put it very firmly in the 20th century, early 20th century usually. Mm-hmm. If you take the pictures out, I would absolutely go with something earlier. What about gender? Who embodies or who lives in this space, gender-wise? Man, woman, doesn't matter. Large family, small family, nuclear family.
I would say it evokes more of like female aristocratic idleness, like in
That's a lovely way of putting it. Female aristocratic idleness. I like that, yeah.
yeah, and so, but of course also I think it would be maybe yeah, not absence of masculinity. So,
Mhm.
but I would put it more like on a scale towards femininity. Yeah.
Looks more a bit like a drawing room where someone would probably sit somewhere and knit and embroider. Yeah.
It could also be a small family room.
Yeah. Okay.
Because there's so many
Chairs.
and sitting options.
Okay. Yeah. What about family, children? Small children, older children, no children? You're just no children at all. It wouldn't stay as pristine if you had children. There's also an absence of toys, so there's potentially not a child, or unless it's a kind of Victorian child which is properly raised and doesn't play and has its own playroom or something. So potentially not exactly a family room because of the absence of, anything that would indicate that. What about sexuality? We've been talking about family. That is my phone. Oh, it's always good if it's ringing if you are teaching. This is exactly what shouldn't happen for you, but it can happen for me. No. What about sexuality? Heterosexuality? Homosexuality? No. We immediately kind of assume, of course, family, yeah, man, wife, that's totally who's living there. Potentially, in their later 50s, early 60s, someone, who's very aristocratic, very settled, very sedate, something. This is exactly the idea we get. We don't really get a lot of it. There is not a lot of dynamic, not a lot of dynamics, movements, small children, etc., etc. We have immediate ideas about who lives there, who acts in this room, who embodies sort of these ideals that this room gives us. So this is what we talk about. If there is not an innocent background and not an innocent setting, and this is sort of, if you put actors in there, that would be the mise en scène. This is exactly all the objects that we need for a scene that are being put in the frame, usually including the actors and the blocking and so on and so forth. And these frames always gives us already something that we can use for an analysis, etc. And I think this is all. Yes, this is what it says. It's mise en scène. One of the sort of more often used phrases when we talk about film, it's always about the mise en scène. This is basically just the setup of the scene, the setup of the frame. And of course we can go through films scene or frame by frame. This is sometimes done, especially if you want to do an in-depth analysis of these things. So then we had, this is something you should not anyways. So the mise en scène, or at least the rooms that are being shown, also have limits. So it's not just that it enables a visual portrayal of something, of class, etc., but it limits it. And this is, for instance, a set of a sitcom. So if you're a fan of sitcoms, then have a look whether they have ceilings, because most of the sitcoms don't, especially if it's traditional sitcoms like, what? Today is Tuesday, obviously. No, but generally, I'm going to switch off the, honestly, it's lovely. This is exactly how seminars should go. This was my supervisor. Talking about sitcoms, and my supervisor for my PhD topic just kind of writes an email. I mean, okay, so sitcoms generally don't have ceilings. Friends doesn't have a ceiling. Big Bang Theory doesn't have a ceiling. You never really see the top of the room. So the mise en scène, the frames or the rooms in which these settings occur, or in which these plots occur, they all have limits. They cannot show everything. They only show particular parts to us. And we're usually not quite aware, because who of you knew that sitcoms don't really have ceilings? Damn it, there's always one. But generally people aren't aware, because you don't really look for the framing. You look at the actors and what happens, and everything that kind of draws your focus. And this is particularly done in sitcoms. There's not much, but usually you have those eye-catching, either it's the actor or it's a really red sofa or anything. You always have some kind of focus that you don't go like, so no suspension of disbelief in this case. So what we have to talk about is clothes and costume. I'm just going to sum up what most of you have already said. It's light and color. It is also, and this is one of the examples, so light does something. It is vital if we analyze it. It creates a certain mood, because we were talking about the mood. We also could talk about the coloring of these scenes. So in this case, Daniel Radcliffe is kind of merges with the background, but it's kind of slightly darker. Usually we also see a color grading, so we have the very pervasive orange-blue grading where everyone is kind of a bit more lifelike and a bit more saturated and orangey than the backgrounds, whereas the backgrounds usually are very much bluish or grayish, so that the people really, I really hate saying that, but so that they really pop, so they can really see that. So it creates a very strong contrast between background and foreground. Talking about color, it also creates character in the sense of certain colors already indicate that in this case, this is a scene from The Crown. In this case, Margaret Thatcher is wearing her blue, or Gillian Anderson playing Margaret Thatcher is wearing a blue costume, and that already tells you that she doesn't really fit in. So it's during a visit in Balmoral, and the Queen and everyone else is kind of dressed in these hunting clothes, and Margaret Thatcher isn't, because she didn't expect that she had to be hiking. So I think she's wearing Wellington boots, which is a really interesting contrast. But simply the color tells you quite a bit about the scene, even if you haven't seen it, because you know she doesn't fit in. Everyone else does, with the background, with the colors, etc. But she doesn't. She's the odd one out, literally and figuratively in this case. And that kind of already, even without seeing the scene, you kind of know that simply from the coloring and from the setup of the scene. Moving on to actor movement, this is what the actors do on camera. It's the blocking, it's the staging. We have camera work. That is focus and distance. It does matter who is in focus. So if I just go back to this, she is in focus. That's a shallow depth of field, or called a shallow depth of field. She's in focus. Everything else isn't. That's kind of blurred out. There's also, if everything would be sharp and focus on, that would be deep staging, where you see everything, where foreground, background, and middle ground usually have a relation to one another. In this case, the background isn't really important apart from setting the scene, as it were. So it's camera, focus, and distance. This is, again, an embodiment. You have the foreground is focused on. The second one should be that the middle ground is focused on. And the latter, or the last one, is that the background is focused on. So you have basically foreground, middle ground, background, and of course that sort of again sets the scene, because on the one hand I'm focusing either on the stone, on the character itself, or on the background, and that always tells its particular own story. And I think I also have deep staging. That would be deep staging where everything is in focus, and all these elements are used to tell the story, and not just the character, not just the foreground, but everything in general is used to do just that. If we talk about camera, we need to talk about framing. So this is a long shot or a full shot. You can see the entire character. You usually, I'm not going to show you all the film clips, so I'm just going to go with that. But generally, the framing is important. This is a long shot. You see everything. Usually, these shots are used as establishing shots. If you've seen Pride and Prejudice, the 1995 version, I think, with Colin Firth, when you see Pemberley for the first time, it's this huge mansion, and you see a lot of the grounds right around. That's a long shot, or a full shot, where you see an establishing, or where the scene is established, where the characters are established, where everything is in focus, because everything matters. Then there is a medium long shot. It's usually more character focused, used for conversation, and sort of if people sit next to one another, it creates a relationship between the characters, but you still see most of the character. You see the costumes, you see the interior design. Usually it's also, if it's deep staging, like in this particular frame, you see the background. So both of these things matter, both the relationship of the characters, but also in which setting they are put in. Then there is the camera usually gets closer, surprise, surprise. So we have a medium shot where you usually only see the upper body, you see the torso. Going even closer, we have a medium close-up where you can see the shoulder, so it's a portrait shot. again, often used for conversation, especially intimate conversation. That's something, you know, the closer the camera gets, the more intimate is the relationship between the viewer and the characters. But usually if you talk to someone, you don't get as close as that. You don't get right into their faces. But this is a form of showing and creating intimacy with the characters. And creating intimacy, we can also have a close-up where you usually see facial expressions. So again, even more intimacy is created. It's of course artificial intimacy, but you see small movements, small facial expressions. And this is sort of where character arcs, plots are driven through these small moments and through close-ups. And then there is the extreme close-up, which is a bit weird in this case, but generally this is only to show something that, for instance, you would not see in a medium close shot or in a medium long shot. So if someone kind of, you usually see that in films like heist movies where you have a sleight of hand, where you see something very small being taken away. You wouldn't see that in a medium long shot. If someone just goes and you're not really focused on that, then no one sees that. But this is how you use close or extreme close-ups in order to show particular details. No surprise there. I just need to have a look. We have the height and angles. This is partially the last part. Maybe as a side note, I also have uploaded the film techniques and full explanations on OPAL, so you'll find it there because you don't need to write all of that down, just in case you're doing that. So we have height and angles, and I think this is something you should or are already familiar with it, because that's usually, I think, covered in arts classes, I believe, or at least it was in mine, but it's been some time since then. You have the regular angle, so usually eye level. You have the bird's eye view from above. You have a high angle where you see just kind of the top of a person. You have a low angle and a super low angle. And all of these angles, usually you also have a Dutch angle, for instance, where everything is kind of in a 45-degree angle or set in a 45-degree angle. I think the regular explanation is that it creates tension but also uncertainty. In this case, these are very certain angles, but they also tell their own stories. It's always, I really dislike saying that, but they kind of still do. So it creates hierarchy, for instance. It creates power hierarchies within a scene. So if someone is usually shown from a super low or a low angle, and if you look at, for instance, the Avenger movies, the first one where they all have these establishing shots where the camera sort of moves around the group, it's always filmed from a slightly low angle, which makes them seem even more, that bit more epic, which is, of course, in this case, used to already tell its own story, namely that they will triumph, simply because they're already shown in this kind of, not the epic, but the low angle. If they were filmed from a high angle or a bird's eye view, that establishing shot wouldn't really work in the same, bless you, in the same form as it does in this particular movie. So angles are important in this case. I'm just listing all the parts. When we talk about sound, it's a bit more difficult because usually we have diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. There are different levels of sound, so it depends on what's spoken. If you hear music within the scene, if it's soundtrack, those are varying levels of sound. So we have speech, music, soundtrack, and sound effects. That can be diegetic or non-diegetic. Diegetic meaning that they occur within that scene. So if you have a example would be Bridgerton, one of the first balls in the first season. You see a quartet or a cello quartet sitting there playing some songs. That would be diegetic. The music happens within the scene. If they go outside and the music stays at the same volume, for instance, then the music would move from diegetic to non-diegetic, because then sort of, especially if they're far away and you still hear the music playing, then the music obviously doesn't happen within the scene. You can't see the players. The music isn't played right in the scene, but it's of course used as a soundtrack, and then it becomes non-diegetic, namely not made, so to speak, in the film, in the scene. And non-diegetic sounds can be intra or extra-diegetic, meaning sound effects are of course usually a bit louder than they are in general. So especially, I always have to think of anime movies and the steps, especially if they walk upstairs and it always kind of goes the tap, tap, tap. Your feet don't make these sounds, at least mine don't, which is a bit sad really. But generally they don't, and that would be an intradiegetic sound. And then there is extradiegetic, which is soundtrack, something that is not only being made for this film, but for instance, if you add some kind of hip-hop song that wouldn't occur in a, I don't know, 19th century periodic drama, then that would be an extradiegetic sound, or it would be considered to be non-diegetic, extradiegetic. Usually we don't really juggle with intra and extradiegetic. It's however important to know it's diegetic or non-diegetic in order to analyze scenes and in order to analyze films. Which brings us to this part, namely a scene, and finally some work for you after I've spent, again, too much time talking. What I want you to do is basically, we're going to watch that scene. I'm going to also show that for the people, you know, on the outside, after I have switched off my sound perfectly. We're going to watch that. What I want you to do is kind of work with the person sitting next to you, or before you in this case, and just go through the scene. I'm going to show it at least twice, thrice even. What I want you to do is to do the following. So first is camera movement, of course. Again, that's why I said you have the handout already on OPAL. Go through the camera angles, through the camera movement. So how does the camera move? What does the camera focus on? What's in the scene? How is the setting, or sort of how is the room set up? All of these things that we kind of touched upon, just go through it. Not so much the sound, we're just kind of not talking about that at the moment, but simply what you see on camera, what's visualized to you, and how is it, you know, which angles are used, etc., etc. So go through the film techniques and kind of try to analyze this particular scene. And I'm going to show it now. Give me a second. Yeah.
Do you feel a chill draft? A chill and sickly draft?
She's a natural child. Nobody knows her parent. She's not even Smith herself. It's not mysterious.
Miss Taylor would have found it.
The misfortune of your birth, Harriet, ought to make you particularly careful as to your associates. There can be no doubt of your being a gentleman's daughter. You must support your claim to that station by everything within your power.
Know you the Martins, Miss Woodhouse? Have I been on a farm?
I know that they are tenant farmers. They rent their farm from Mr. Knightley.
They were ever so kind to me this summer. When I went away, Mrs. Martin was so very kind as to send Mrs. Goddard a beautiful goose. The finest goose Mrs. Goddard had ever seen, she said.
The Martins are precisely the order of people with whom I feel I can have nothing to do. A degree or two lower might interest me. If they were very poor, I might hope to be useful to them in some way, but a farmer can need none of my help, and is therefore as much above my notice as he is below it.
Mr. Robert Martin went 3 miles one day to bring me walnuts, because he
A minute or two just to kind of go through it already, and then I'm going to show it again. Just give me a sign that you've kind of, you know, let it stew for a second. Okay, then let's watch the scene again until this point, which is 2:16. Okay. And I'm just going to up the volume a bit so that you can actually hear it. Here we go.
There is a new parlour boarder, Papa, at Miss Scottard's school. Miss Smith.
There, distinctly. Do you feel it? A chill draft. A chill and sickly draft.
She's a natural child. Nobody knows her parentage, not even Miss Smith herself. So not mysterious.
Miss Taylor would have felt it.
The misfortune of your birth, Harriet, ought to make you particularly careful as to your associates. There can be no doubt of your being a gentleman's daughter. You must support your claim to that station by everything within your power.
Know you the Martins, Miss Woodhouse, of Abbey Mill Farm?
I know that they are tenant farmers. They rent their farm from Mr. Knightley.
They were ever so kind to me this summer. When I went away, Mrs. Martin was so very kind as to send Mrs. Goddard a beautiful goose. The finest goose Mrs. Goddard had ever seen, she said.
The Martins are of precisely the order of people with whom I feel I can have nothing to do. A degree or two lower might interest me. If they were very poor, I might hope to be useful to them in some way, but a farmer can need none of my help, and is therefore as much above my notice as he is below it.
Mr. Robert Martin went 3
That's that again. I'm going to give you another 2 to 3 minutes, and then we're going to talk about it. All right? Good. right. Even though some of you are still talking, let's get sort of back to the scene. Okay, what were your impressions filmically, like visually? Or should we start with something else? I'm not quite sure. Yes, please.
So in general, what first struck me is the symmetries. It's very centered, and I think that underlines like a general feel of artificiality and theatricality of the mise en scène.
Yes.
And yeah, for example, as I said, the symmetry, there are two footmen, and also, especially in the shot when Harriet walks towards the house, she walks first central, and we see behind her and share in her impression of the house, how impressive it is. And then it turns around, and we see the wonder on her face, and then she starts swaying, so it kind of underlines that she's out of place, because she's out of center. When she walks towards the house. Yeah. And yeah, also, of course, the colors, this pastel palette also lends itself to this kind of artificiality, and also, I think, represents the class divide. As the footmen, they wear darker tones, and Emma, as the highest ranked female, wears white, and yeah, so.
Yeah. It's actually good because you said kind of when we talked about coloring that, you know, pastel colors and shy characters, whereas main characters usually wear very bold colors, and this doesn't really work in this very scene because, of course, the footman and everyone who's kind of lower class wears very bold colors, whereas everyone else is, as you said, in this sort of pastel, very artificial coloring, and with these colors being very desaturated and very kind of nice. They all look very feminine, but also very nice. Yes.
I would also say this with the lighting, which was like made up the daylight, I would say.
Yeah.
It had also given that typically Jane Austen movie light and airy vibe, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I also wonder if the reason why Emma's wearing this white dress, maybe it's also like this aristocratic pureness and this youthfulness that she also portrays.
Yeah. Also, I mean, if you're wearing white, if I wear white, then I can definitely say within 10 minutes or whether in 10 seconds potentially there's something on it, some stain that mysteriously appeared. And that she's obviously wearing white for a very long time also goes into the question of innocence and purity, but modern kinds, because at that point in time, light blue or baby blue is seen as the color of purity and not so much white in this case. But of course, it also shows that she doesn't really do yard work, and which is mirrored in the dialogue when she kind of talks about the Martin family. They're farmers. Are they useful to me? All of these things kind of go or are being shown again in the costuming. She doesn't do any heavy work, any yard work. She usually is very sedate in this case. Yes?
And also because you said something like with this symmetrical thing, I wonder, just because I read the book and I know some of the story, with these two footmen and her father sitting in the middle at the beginning and her sitting on the right. So there's like somebody missing on the left. Maybe that's also constructed because like her teacher just moved off because she married.
Mrs. Taylor, or Miss Taylor in this case, she would have known, so she usually occupies the left-hand seat. Just going to go back to the this one. Yeah, so you can see that there's a lack or an absence on the left-hand side where usually Miss Taylor sits in this case. Yeah. What else? Yes.
Also, this like I think it's a long shot at the beginning to also show this room and these this like to show that they're probably more wealthy because of the whole look of it, and also because of the footman, and then this table in the middle, which also just has two people and the rest is all empty. And also I think like the look on Emma's face is also like she's like a little lonely because she's looking like, I wish there were more people.
Yeah. It's also indicated with the food you have a lot of sweets, you have a very lavish display of food. That would not be the case with other classes, for instance. Yeah? Any other comments, film technical wise?
We also noticed that like these 4 people really belong in that room. Like when you look at the lines, not really. Like how is it called? Like the gardinen.
The drapes.
Yeah.
I think, again, I know that from an Avengers movie because Iron Man says, does your mother know that you're wearing her drapes? So this is why I know what it is.
Okay.
Random, you know, but go on, sorry.
Yeah, but the colors of the drapes like perfectly fit all of the costumes of the actors.
Mm-hmm. Especially the green, so they literally blend into the furniture, yeah? Which also tells us quite a bit about the station of the servants. They are literally only in the background. Yeah?
I would also say, like, with the camera movement, there's like this, whatever, I can finish the sentence, when Emma is talking to her father and she's telling him things that it moves like in on these 2 people, I think medium shot?
You are talking about this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So because she's like trying to form this conversation with him, and it's in her perspective, it's like these 2 people.
Yeah.
But her father isn't really listening, so then he goes on like with there's like wind coming, then
Yeah,
he goes
it's a
out
draft.
again. Yeah,
Mhm.
because he's more focused on this that Miss Taylor is missing and this like
Yeah.
again this empty table thing, I think.
Yeah, it's also quite fascinating that he does his bit, so to speak, and she keeps talking to him actually, but he is definitely not listening. Mm-hmm. She also looks to the left-hand side, so she's kind of like talking to the missing person on the left-hand side, which is quite interesting. Okay, yes.
When there's the scene with Harriet and Emma, when they're drinking their tea, it's also in the beginning, it's moving into the room, so you can see the room in general for the beginning.
Yep.
And then you have these portrait shots of each person, and then sometimes you have both of them. For example, I saw that in the one shot where they are beginning to sip their cups of tea, and that Harriet is looking over to Emma, seeing how she holds the cup, and so they probably wanted to let us see this one detail to see how the ranking is as well, not just through the colors but also through their body movements.
Yeah, and that's of course, you know, the advantage of a medium close shot. You can see Harriet is kind of nervous. She's very uncertain where to put things, what to do. So that of course is helped by the camera movement. Again, you wouldn't see that if it were, you know, a long shot, for instance. Okay, last comment.
Also on the same scene, like it starts in this long shot to show again the room, I think, and the servants running around and stuff, and then it like moves in to focus more on the 2 main characters of the scene, and then this jumping that you said. And also I think you can also see that Harriet doesn't really fit into this room because she has like this, I think, bolder red jacket thing, and that just pokes out completely out of these light room colors.
It's also heavily in a green-red contrast, so she really sticks out like a sore thumb because I think the background, I could show you, but I can't because the presentation has just kind of decided to, nope. But it's very pastel green, light green, and she's wearing this really red kind of shawl, I believe. I don't want to call it a robe, but she's wearing red, and that kind of sets her apart as the sort of odd one out, again in this scene, like Margaret Thatcher with her blue dress and the Highlands. But I think, what am I thinking about? It's Tuesday morning, it's already that bad. But what I wanted to say, I think, because of everyone's kind of moving upstairs, we're already done for this week. Next week we're meeting back up here. We're going to finish talking about heritage films in general, and then we're going to start with Lord of the Rings, and I'll prepare 2 scenes for you, and then you can go through them at your leisure within the confines of this seminar. So, okay, see you next week. Have a good week, and yeah, see you.